I'm going to show you how to make basic graphs in Stata. So notice that I have opened the data set that we used on the third day of class in the Econ Computer Lab, this World Bank data, and I want to draw your attention to one other thing, which is that I have a do file with all of the commands that we're going to go through right here, and I'll show you some specific parts of this do file as we go through. So let's start by graphing GDP per capita over the time series of this data set, which is 1960 to 2014 for Argentina. Now the command for graph in Stata is pretty straightforward. It's graph. Everything gets more complicated after this. So you tell Stata you want it to graph something, and then you have to tell it what type of graph you want it to produce. So in this case, we want it to produce a two-way graph. And specifically, we want it to produce a line graph. So graph what? Graph a two-way graph and make that a line. So now we have to tell it what two things we want it to graph. So let's look for GDP per capita in our variable list, because we probably don't remember specifically what it's called. And here it is, real GDP per capita. Now, year is pretty straightforward. It's just year. And now we want it to graph this data only if country equals Argentina. Now, because the countries are given as names, not numbers, this has to be in quotations. This tells Stata that it's looking for a name, not a number. And there you go. So here's our year, right? Here's real GDP per capita in constant 2005 US dollars. Where does this very long name for our y-axis comes from? Notice that this is the label for that variable. And this is over the time period given. Now, let's add some things to this graph to make it easier to read. And the thing we're going to start with is this, right? This y title is pretty long. Let's shorten it. And so to shorten it, and you can just re-click on your command, okay? To shorten it, we need to add something to this. Now, in order to format a graph, you have to put a comma, okay? Because this tells Stata to separate the things that you are graphing from formatting of the graph. So the command for the title for your y-axis is yTitle. And again, because it's a name and not a number, this has to go in quotation marks. So let's just call this constant US 2005 US dollars. And there you go. It is changed. Now let's focus on changing the x-axis. We're going to do two things. One, we're just going to capitalize year. And two, right, notice that these are 20-year gaps, and we might want labels every 10 years, for example, right, to tell us when 1970 is, 1990, 2000, etc. Okay. So to change the x-axis title, it's pretty straightforward. It's just x title. Let's call that year. And now to change the markations, the command for that is xlabel. Notice there is a running theme that you put the command, and then everything after that goes in parentheses. So xlabel, and our labeling starts in 1960 and it ends, let's say, in 2020, because the data goes from 1960 to 2014. And we want it to mark every 10 years, right, from this beginning to this end point in time. Okay, so 10 inside our parentheses. There you go. Right, so notice now we have marks every 10 years. Now, for you guys to really see how xlabel works, let's try a different labeling. Let's say we want it to tell us every 5 years. And we don't want it to go to 2020, we want it to go to 2015. There you go. Right, so 1960, 1965, blah, 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 right until 2015. So I actually prefer the 10-year labeling. And instead of going to 2020, because we don't have data that goes that far out, that goes to 2015. I find that this is a lot more user-friendly. Well, there's one other label that we can add, and that is one for the entire graph, right? So we can give a title to the graph, because right now, we don't really know what we're looking at. So the command for the title of the entire graph is title. And again, because it's a name and not a number, it's inside quotation marks. So this is real GDP per capita. There you go. So before we add on, I want to quickly go back to the do file to show you. Right here are all of our labels, different ways that we've played around with it. And here's the last thing that we have, right, that has a label for the x-axis, a title for both of our axes, and a title for the graph. Now, in your do file, you're seeing that this is getting a little bit long. And so you might be wondering if there's an easier way to write it in a do file, such that you can write it in several lines and not just one. And indeed you can. Basically, you have to tell Stata to override its default, which is just to look for the end of a line, right, as the end of the command. So basically, when the typing ends, Stata executes the command. So by typing this, number delimit semicolon, you're telling Stata, look, instead of just looking for the end of the typing, right, the end of the line, I want you to wait until you see the semicolon, and that is when you should execute the command. So in this way, you can write over as many lines as you want, and then when you're done, you put the semicolon, and Stata knows that you're finished with the command and it should execute. And then if you want to revert back so that you don't continue to have to type the semicolon after every subsequent command, right, you type number delimit space CR and the thing that you set the new delimiter as, and then Stata will revert back to its default. Okay, so now what we're going to do is add a country. Okay, so let's look at GDP per capita for both Argentina and Chile. So we know that this is part of the graphing section, right, not the formatting section, so it's going to come before that comma. Okay, so let's put a space. And then to tell Stata you want to graph something else, it's 2 vertical lines, right? So Stata reads 1 vertical line as OR, and so you're going to do 2 vertical lines. And then you're going to say, look, I want you to graph another line. I want you to graph GDP per capita and year if country equals Chile. There you go. Okay, so right now this looks pretty terrible, and it's really hard to tell which country is which, so we'll talk about fixing that in a second. And also now our y-axis looks pretty terrible too, so we'll talk about fixing that. But first let's focus on fixing this legend, right? Because the variable names are so long, this legend isn't even telling us, right, which country is which, okay? So in order to fix that, the command is legend, okay? So legend, and again, everything is inside parentheses. And basically what we want is to create our own labels, okay? So label, and then what we want to do is label the first line, okay? That's what this tells us. And again, because it's a name, it has to go in quotations. And our first line is Argentina. And now we want to give a label to our second line. Our second line is Chile. Okay, so basically you have legend, parentheses, close parentheses, and then labels for each of your lines. And that needs a close parentheses. All right, there you go. It looks so much better, right? And actually now our y-axis looks better as well, but even so, I'm going to tell you how to fix this. So let's say that we actually don't want anything here, right? We don't really want a title for our y-axis because we think it's pretty self-evident. Here's what you can do. So let's go back to y title. Notice that we had all of this. Take that out and just put nothing, right, in between your quotations. Basically telling Stata, I don't want a title there. And now we can do real GDP per capita, US dollars, right? Maybe make the title of our graph a little more obvious. There we go, right? So that's much easier to read. So let's add, actually, let's not add one more. First, I want to talk about changing the scheme. Okay, so notice this has colors. Maybe if you're colorblind, this red line isn't easy to read. You might think, can I make this a black and white graph or have this look some other way? And indeed, you can. So edit, if you go to edit, so I'm going to show you how to do this in the graph window and then how to do it directly through a command. Apply new scheme. Okay, so you want to apply a new scheme. So the current scheme is S2 color. Okay, and that's what's giving us this graph. Let's pick a different one. Let's pick, this is one that I really like a lot, S1 monochrome, and apply. Okay. And there you go. So you can play around. Let's do one more scheme, and then you guys can play around with this. So there's one, this one's kind of cool, economist, apply. Okay, and this will create a graph that looks very much like the ones that you see in The Economist. Now, you may be wondering, how do I do this directly in my do file, right, so that I can always create the same graph? Here's how you do this. So the command is scheme, and then, for example, S1 mono looks like that. Okay, or I think it's economist. Let's try economist. And it's going to look like this. Okay, so in your do file, this is how scheme, and then you can look up in the help window, you know, the specific scheme that you're interested in. Okay, so finally, let's add one more country so that you feel comfortable continuing to add. And then I think you'll have a pretty good idea of how to make graphs in Stata. Okay, so again, we're in our graphing section prior to our comma. 2 more vertical lines. Then we're telling Stata, I want you to graph a line. I want you to continue to graph real GDP per capita and year if country equals, whoops, let's add in Brazil. Okay, and we've added that line, which means we also need to add in the label. Okay, so now we have our third line. Okay, let's keep this economist scheme, and there we go. Right, and again, if you don't like that, you can go through and play around with different schemes. So reverse color. All right. So now I think you're ready to go and ready to graph things in Stata. Don't forget to type everything up in your do file so that you can always recreate your graphs.